Hello, everyone. I am Mark L. Vincent. I am the director of the Convene Consulting Network. And today I am very privileged to have a good friend, Marcus Bigelow, here for a conversation about stewarding kingdom minded businesses, especially when it's a multi generational concern. And I've known Marcus a while, and Marcus is deeply experienced on the pastoral ministry side of life and the business side of life, and has a deep well of stories and experiences with family businesses and helping them manage succession. And it seemed like a good moment in time to sit down with him and invite him to share a bit out of his wisdom to anyone out there who might be facing these matters. And so, Marcus, I really want to welcome you to this conversation, and I'm eager to hear what you might have to say. And I really like to plunge into these conversations and kind of go for it right away. So I'm going to do that with you. And because you've walked with a lot of leaders and businesses, and you've watched them build them, well, start them, of course, and then build them, and then exit them. So, in general, whether it's a family business or not, what are some of the must do's? We might call them the must haves in order to be able to build toward a successful succession.
Well, I think the number one thing is some awareness of some of the dynamics that go into it. Only 30% of businesses that transfer actually successfully transfer to another generation.
Wait,
By the
can you
time
say that again? That's a small percentage. You said
only
30%?
30% transfer from first to second generation. Only 30% of that transfers to the next generation, and on and on. So by the time you get to the third generation, less than 4% are actually making it.
That sounds almost like the same percentage that getting an entrepreneurial start would be. So you already have a big fall off just to get the thing to exist, and then
Yeah.
to go to a next generation. Oh my goodness, that's minimal.
And it's interesting, in almost every literature there's something along the line of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The Scottish have it, the Japanese have it, the Chinese have it, the Italians have it, we have it. So it's a difficult thing transferring to the next generation. And I haven't seen any difference between Christians and non-Christians. I don't have any good stats on that. But I know that overall that's the statistic. And the number one reason that family businesses don't transfer to the next generation is psychological. It's not lack of financial planning. It's not lack of legal planning. It's either the heirs haven't been prepared enough, or there's conflict in the family. And I always say that, transferring a family business is the perfect storm, because every family has some dysfunction. And then you add in money and power and sibling rivalry. And in a lot of cases, especially in the startup mode, a mom or a dad who is overcommitted to the business, just struggling to keep it alive. And then they step out, and there's this vacuum here. And so it's almost this perfect storm where people rush in, or bad motives rush in. So the must do is build good trust and communication with your family. If there's anything that will allow a business to transfer, it's that trust, that communication, and then the preparation. That's the other side of the coin, is the preparation. So I think those would be my must-dos or must-haves. And the problem is that as business owners, we get consumed with our business. And sometimes we don't take into account things like, maybe the son or daughter doesn't really want to be in that business. And I always say that a family business shouldn't be a lifetime sentence. But, sometimes a business needs to get sold just because there's no heirs available, or that are qualified or that want to do it. So I think that's a piece of it. I think self-awareness on the part of the first generation, or the one who's passing it down, is important. There's 4 models of transfer. One is the monarch model, which is, you'll carry me out in a box And that leaves everybody grieving and trying to figure out what to do then. And so there's this big power struggle. And usually by that time, dad's 80 years old or mom's 80 years old. The second one is the general's model, which is I shall return. And I've seen it happen where I've had a family that was trying to, the father said, I want to pass this to my kids. But he'd set it up so that they would fail and he'd have to come back in riding on his white horse and save the day because it was about him. It wasn't about really passing it on to the kids. A third one is the governor model, which says I'll serve until X number of days, then I'm out of here, and good luck. And then the last one, which I think is the correct one, is maybe the statesman model, where you move from ownership to partial ownership to no ownership, in 3 or 4 stages, and you stay on as an elder statesman, but remove yourself from the power as things go on.
So it almost seems, Marcus, that if you're going to build a business, that you will have successors, especially if they are in the family in some fashion, that you actually have to build that part of the business too in intentional ways so that this trust factor increases. Am I going down the right path here?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. If you don't intentionally plan for that and provide training, provide mentoring, but provide for relationships that work. I mean, I think, the owner who spends time building relationships with his children is huge. Talking about transparency about what's going on in the business, transparency about, who's going to do what when I leave, because a lot of times it's 2 or 3 siblings and, somebody gets their feelings hurt because I want to be CEO. No, I want to be CEO. That can, if they don't work on that ahead of time, that's a big thing. One of the things that I've watched several successful families, we have a family of French Canadians who moved to California 5 generations ago. Successful farming family, huge agribusiness, and they have a family council that every year that meets 3 or 4 times a year, and they deal with family issues as it relates to the business. Not everybody can be a board member because now there's 150 people in this family council, but they bring them to the family, and they do something that's really interesting. Is every year they do a cousins camp where they bring the kids in from 5 to 17, and they all assume roles and responsibilities in the family business. And if they're 5 years old, maybe they pick some stuff and run a fruit stand. If they're 17, they may actually be working in the accounting department or the managing some harvest or something like that. And they use that family camp to bring people in from across the country. But first of all, it makes everybody like each other because they get to hang together. But it also gives them a chance to preview talents and preview skills and that kind of thing. And everybody comes through it. So far has come through it really well. I mean, this is a family that you'd be pleased to be a part of. And they're strong. I mean, they're strong leaders. I mean, this is not a bunch of wishy-washy people. These are strong leaders, but they really focus on building that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So family council, family camps, those kind of things are really good.
Yeah. So let's go deeper into family business itself. And there are some reoccurring dynamics that you probably already have touched on that you just see again and again and again, things that families should be intentional about, navigate around. What else would you add to that that just keeps showing up in the consultative projects and conversations that you've had over the years?
Well, one is that there's at least 3 things that have to be transferred. One is governance. Well, one is ownership. And that's who's going to hold the stock, who's going to, have that kind of a thing. The second is governance, and that's not always the same. fact, a lot of times you have family members who can own stock, but they really shouldn't be governing. And then the third one is management. So the governance is, how are we going to make the big decisions? How are we going to set policies? And then the management is, how are we going to run it day to day? And I think if you think about those three venues, that's certainly an important one.
How soon, before you go on, how soon should a family really get the governance stuff licked? I keep running into stories where we're going to get to that, we're going to get to that, we're going to get to that, and they never do. So where in that arc of developing that business should strong governance really start to come into play?
Wow. That's probably a situational question.
Okay.
But my sense is the earlier the better. I mean, I don't think at 35 you want to start doing transferring governance to kids, but because, if Johnny who's 5 or something like that, that's not good. But we're working with a couple of families that they've been working on it now for 4 years, 5 years, because it doesn't go quickly sometimes. And part of it was tax planning, part of it was the legal. They had a very complex legal situation, but their kids, the parents it's 2 brothers who are leading this company. And they started 5 years ago. They're probably 60 years old. So they probably started at 55. And they probably have another 5 years or 10 years of being in the governance part of it, but they're starting to invite people in to the process. They did an interesting thing. You've heard of the 5 behaviors of cohesive teams.
Sure.
And normally that's done in management. They had some family issues. And so they did the 5 behaviors of a cohesive family that we had a chance to work through. And it was interesting to see, to begin with, there was some real bitterness in the room. Mom was bitter about some kids. Kids were bitter about mom and dad. There'd been hurt feelings. And halfway through that process, we had a real breakthrough. And it was like we went from war to peace all of a sudden. But it was, hanging in there was tough. It was a little scary for a while. But now the family is united and families together. So I think working on some of those uncomfortable issues is really important. And I think we just talked about this today in a meeting that I was in. I think giving your kids a blessing, it's kind of an old-fashioned concept, but it's so important. I saw one fail. The dad was a tough old buzzard who was never gonna tell his son he was proud of him or that he loved him. And the son literally worked himself into a heart attack and into the hospital trying to get his dad's favor.
Oh.
And we have this need to be blessed by our dad. And so the earlier that can start, that can start at 5 years old. We didn't have a family business, but my dad called me every Sunday night till now, from the time I was 21 until now, to tell me he was proud of me.
Wow.
And it gives you a strength from which to build.
Yeah.
So I can't emphasize enough, giving your children a blessing along the way.
Sure. You were walking your way through 3 items here, and I cut you off after the first one with my question about governance. What else would you add to some of those reoccurring dynamics, Marcus?
Thinking through, well, I think, in terms of ownership and governance, and, the ownership one is probably the easiest.
Okay.
From a legal standpoint, you can, an attorney can draw it. Now, where it gets sticky is when we think we have to be equal. And not everybody has to be equal, but they do have to be equitable. So you may have one heir that is more needy or less able to take care of themselves. Equal may not be may not be a good thing. And so that's one thing to think about in terms of the ownership transfer. And that's where it gets a little sticky unless you've had good communication prior. In the management piece, that's probably the most thorny, because a lot of times our kids grow up with the expectation that someday I'll be the CEO. And I think that there's a stewardship piece of this thing that says, what if I'm not the right person? It's not just about me. It's not just about our family. You know, we have 400 employees and their families and 600 vendors and 1,200 customers who all depend on us. And so how do I steward that? And maybe I'm not the right one to be the next CEO. You know, maybe my role is is in sales, or my role is in accounting.
Mm-hmm.
But do I have the humility to hire a non-family CEO to come in, and I'll be part of the governance process, and I'll be part of the management team, maybe, or maybe I won't even be part of that. But how do I, you know, I think we have to teach our kids the stewardship, that this doesn't just belong to us. This is bigger. This is God's business. And how are you going to do that?
You have touched on a number of dynamics that are often delayed or pushed off until they can't be pushed off anymore. And I would just guess that you would have an illustration out of your experience of a family that, boy, it looked like they weren't going to get it done, but they got some stuff turned around and are a much better set of stewards now than they might have been. Could you give us an illustration like that?
Well, I think the family that I just talked about, when we started that, I wouldn't have given you a plug nickel for our chances of resurrecting that one. And just because we're believers doesn't mean we necessarily make good decisions. And doesn't necessarily mean we're nice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it ought to make us kind, but not always are we nice. And so this was a family that was fraught with issues. And it took persistence. It took some courage. There were some kids that shouldn't be in leadership and shouldn't be in management, who were bullies, and they had to work through some of those kind of things. And it was some hard decisions. It wasn't all, you know, I can't say that it's always been peaches and cream, but I think the business is going to survive going into the next generation. And they will do it with a non-family CEO.
I'm impressed with something here, and that is that the work does not get easier. And so if I'm this child who's growing up in the business or whatever, if I have this thought that I deserve the appointment because I'm blood, or that it will be easier now that all the hard work is done, I'm now pursuing a very different mission than the mission that the business has. And I can't think that I can mail it in.
Yeah.
So let's say a business owner comes to you and she has built this up and she actually has delayed. She just has not gotten around to it yet. Life's been busy. She's been growing this business. She can't put it off anymore. And that's often how these client scenarios come up, because now it's just kind of overwhelming and they just can't put it off. And she's still even talking like, you know, when the business is right, I've got to fix a few things first and then I'm going to be ready. Can we plan for this for next year or something like that? What are some of the first steps that she just has to take if she has any hope to really have a good succession plan?
That's where we usually get called in, is when there's pain. The pain is greater than the reward at this point. And I would say that probably a couple things happen. Number one, you need to sit down with all the players and have some frank conversations. This is what I plan to do. This is my thinking at this point. and you may even need a mediator in the room because it might get kind of brutal. And I think that's, sometimes that's the help of bringing in somebody from the outside, is that they can act as the umpire and the referee, and they can diffuse things when it gets too tough. So talking to everybody is certainly a beginning point. Assessing readiness to lead. Sometimes what people forget is that when they started the business, it was a small fledgling business. But if they've been successful, it's now a $40 million a year business, or an $80 million a year business, or a $200 million a year business. If they think back to where they started thinking of coming into a $200 million business rather than starting from scratch, they would be overwhelmed themselves. One of the things that I would say is they need to focus on how do we move from what I will call mom and pop management to professional management. But assessing the kids to say, what's their capabilities, what's their interest? I think that would be certainly part of it. If they haven't done some training up front, they're going to have to cram it in. But anything that they can work on that way might be getting the kids a mentor or a coach. Those would be some of the things that might help that transition. I think that, there's kind of this 4-step process of going from I'm doing it all to I'm doing it with you to you're doing it and I watch. And that's not going to do it in a year and a half or 2 years. It'll be very compressed if it does happen. But there ought to be some of that. I won't leave you just hanging. And I would say, frankly, that if there hasn't been any prep to that point, that it might be that you bring in an outside CEO, outside president for a year or 2 or 3 or 4 until that person can train the successors. And I'm working with a couple businesses right now where they brought in some people who are training people up until there's an interim CEO. It might be 3 years, it might be 7 years. But until there's that ability to transfer it over.
So, Marcus, as we wrap up this conversation, you've pointed to a number of really critical items that have to get in place, and that they really are as important as any other part of the business development, determining a product mix, figuring out your marketplace, all of those things. And yet sometimes there's a cornerstone here. There's something that's like, if it's not there, it is going to fall apart, and everything else can build on that. So among any of these, are there 1 or 2 that you would say, if you're going to build a business that is going to have a success rather than just selling it outright or closing it up, that must be there if it has any chance to be that unicorn? That the 30% of the 30% of the 30% that gets into a 4th or 5th generation, even has a prayer for that. What must be there?
One thing.
But if it's not one thing, that's fine. It just seems like there might be a cornerstone piece here. Like if this isn't here, it's just not going to happen.
I guess I would say it's the family relationship, because 60% of those that fail do so because the family has fallen apart, as the psychological pain has fallen apart. And so the kids flake, the kids leave because they just don't want the pain anymore. And they'd rather have Thanksgiving than a business. So that would be my first thing, would be to spend time building that family relationship, patching it, getting it so that everybody can talk to one another. And if it takes counselors or it takes coaches, if there's one thing that's going to be there, I think that's the one.
It just seems so wise, Marcus, because if you're going to have a family business, there has to be a family. And if you're going to invest in the business to have the business, you're going to have to invest in the family and the family dynamic to have family business. It's just that's maybe a little bit different than the business itself, because it's relational, it's relationships, and it's relatives, and you have that really quirky fabric of all of the dysfunction that can come, as well as all the wonderful holy moments that can come.
Well, and it's all about trust. That, you know, if you have trust, you can get away with a lot of things that weren't quite perfectly done. If you don't have trust, you can have the best business plan and the best accounting and the best everything else, and it's not going to work. Mm-hmm. Which is all part of that family relationship, emotional relationship.
Marcus, you've not only provided good information here, you've displayed your patient way of working with people and thinking things through without pressing hard, which is so important when you're facilitating conversations. I want to thank you for joining me here. And for all of you who've been listening to this, we're going to have Marcus's contact on the screen here in a moment, so you can reach out to him if you'd like to have further conversation. So in the meantime, we'd like to say thank you. Thanks for giving us this time. And thank you to you, Marcus, for your investment in the Convene community and beyond today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.